World of Warcraft Midnight is finally here, and the highly anticipated second part of the Worldsoul Saga has quite a lot to prove. I would even say it is something like a turning point for World of Warcraft. Can the WoW brand still excite longtime fans with its retail expansions? Or are those players now being left to the numerous classic iterations so they can bathe in their nostalgic memories, while modern WoW continues to move further and further away from what once made it so great? I wish we hadn't called it Warcraft, it sounds so intimidating. The returning story chief Chris Metzen is said to have said this once. That's what lead producer Holly Longdale revealed in an interview that stirred up the fan base. Not Metzen, too. He was supposed to be our returning messiah who would bring the war back to Warcraft, just as he himself announced at BlizzCon 2023. And even though I think the hysteria around this interview is a bit exaggerated, and I would claim to have a fairly good idea of what Holly Longdale actually meant by it, more on that later, I can at least partly understand the concerns of the fans. In the expansions before Metzen left, things were about sweating orcs, bloody battles, honor, and duty. Nowadays, it often seems to be about cute pets, feelings, and friendship, all important themes. But I can understand anyone who would like to see a few more badass war moments again. The fact that even the War Within dealt with the supposedly title-defining war against the Nerubians within just one season and used the remaining patches mainly to prepare for Midnight probably has something to do with Chris Metzen's return happening right in the middle of the expansion's hot production phase, when its basic framework had already long been finished. His idea of making not just one expansion but a whole trilogy that ties together all loose story threads in one epic overarching narrative must have overturned many things internally. It is very likely that with Midnight, we will now feel Metzen's handwriting fully again for the first time. And that is what I mean when I say Midnight is a Destiny-defining expansion. Now Blizzard has to show that they still understand what Warcraft actually is. Evaluating an MMO expansion in its release week is always difficult. Only as the season progresses will we see how spectacular the raids are, how motivating the dungeons are, and how interesting the conclusion of the story really is. That's why today we're specifically talking about the leveling experience in Midnight and the story so far, to find out how many real badass Warcraft moments Metzen's new work actually contains. We will also clarify what Holly Longdale might really have meant with her statement in the interview, and why that might actually be pretty cool. Before you raid anything, you first have to reach the new maximum level of 90. For many players, this is an annoying obstacle they want to overcome as quickly as possible so they can finally start grinding in the endgame. I've always hated this development. Why is WoW Classic so popular? Because leveling itself meant something and was a cool experience. Exploring the new zones, the steady progression, all the little stories, that was the game. The endgame was just the cherry on top. It would be presumptuous to say that Midnight returns to that completely, but the leveling phase felt noticeably fulfilling to me and not rushed. Of course, there were again some freaks in this add-on who rushed through everything as fast as possible. But anyone who takes a bit of time and keeps their eyes open for the environment can discover a lot of cool side things. As you remember, in Midnight it's worth it just because the zones are so beautiful. Instead of the dark caverns of the War Within, which certainly were not everyone's taste, we now have expansive natural landscapes and some of the most beautiful skyboxes I've ever seen in WoW. The completely reworked Eversong Woods in the city of Silvermoon were already among the most beautiful areas in the game before. Now they are truly a feast for the eyes that will especially delight Blood Elf fans. In the new leveling zone Zulaman, troll fans will get their money's worth. The WoW race, not internet trolls. The Amani live there, basically trolls who go to the gym, so they have nothing to do with overpriced clothing and instead live in close harmony with their ancestors and gods, the so-called Loa. Fans of James Cameron's Avatar can meet the people of the Haran in the completely new zone Haranda. And oh my god, everything here really looks like Pandora. In this giant natural cavern, the roots of all world trees converge on Azeroth. We explore the history of these tree huggers and later even unlock them as a playable race. After completing all previous zones, we launch a frontal assault into the Void Storm. This ominous vortex hovers above the Sunwell. Here there is mainly a lot of purple and many void monsters to fight. Anyone who thought the earlier zones had too much sunshine and nature will find the perfect backdrop for their misery here. In the Void Storm, several storylines from the expansion's introductory scenario reach a temporary emotional conclusion. The aforementioned introduction scenario provides a strong start to Midnight's story. We fight side by side with Turalyon, Eritor, and Illyria, and wage a massive battle against the Void, just as hinted at in the announcement cinematic. Xal'atath is present the entire time and threatens to take everything we love. But in the end, she doesn't really do much. We temporarily push her back without any major characters being harmed. The destruction of all of Dalaran and Khadgar's supposed death at the beginning of the War Within had far more impact. Midnight falls into the same trap as most recent expansions. The individual quest zones tell more or less self-contained stories that introduce the factions important to the expansion but contribute little to the actual main plot. Important story characters such as the main villain Xal'atath and her followers remain mostly in the background during the leveling phase. Instead, numerous intermediate bosses for dungeons and the first raids are introduced. But the fight against the overarching threat is not always directly tangible or clearly visible. Only the questline about Eretur, the half-elf son of Alaria and Turalyon, who carries both light and void within him and struggles with this duality, breaks somewhat out of this pattern. In search of what it means to be a paladin of the light, we visit many important places from Warcraft history with Eretur, and even get a flashback to the death of the Alliance hero Anduin Lothar during the Second War. That was pure Warcraft feeling, but Blizzard has done a better job in the past of building such WoW moments regularly into the leveling phase. My prime example is always WoW Legion, my favorite expansion from the modern era. There, the threat of the Burning Legion is constantly palpable throughout the entire time. Everything we do in the individual quest zones clearly contributes to the fight against that threat, and fateful moments such as the death of the dragon aspect Izira at the hands of the first raid's end boss Xavius create enormous dramatic weight. When we finally stand in the raid at the end, we know why, and we want revenge against Xavius. Or against Gul'dan in the second raid, the Nighthold, for the heroic death of the human king Varian, which is established right in the intro scenario. Or the most extreme Warcraft villain moment of all, when Sargeras literally plunges his goddamn sword into the planet. Speaking of that, what actually happened to that stupid cursed sword? Blizzard has already announced that Midnight will involve heavy sacrifices and that no major character is safe. But so far, that isn't really noticeable. And that's exactly where the problem lies, because so far we can only experience the beginning of the story in the game. The first chapters of the max-level campaign, where the large overarching conflict will likely return to center stage, are not even in the game yet. At the moment, the story simply ends rather abruptly. Thanks for playing. Feel free to level a few more characters. There's nothing more to see here yet. It's clear why that is. The further progression of the story is probably strongly connected to the upcoming raids, and those don't start until March 18th, with the actual Season 1 and Mythic Plus dungeons even starting a week later. That's a lot of time to fill for WoW players who wanted to jump straight into grinding at release and didn't plan on leveling 6 different characters. So is the story of Midnight so far really a clear turning point for World of Warcraft, and is Chris Metzen's signature much more recognizable again than in the previous expansions? So far, no. Anyone starting Midnight now and expecting a consistently exciting, focused main story with many emotional WoW moments will probably be disappointed, but it is certainly a promising appetizer. Now, the endgame campaign and the raids in the coming weeks still have quite a lot to deliver. After all, even non-raiders can now experience the story there thanks to the story mode, so nothing should stand in the way of big story moments inside the raid itself. On the positive side, World of Warcraft as a game is probably in one of the best gameplay states it has ever been in. Since Dragonflight, Blizzard has carried out many long overdue overhauls, introduced new features that span multiple expansions, and refined them with community feedback. Not every change is immediately popular. The disabling of combat add-ons, for example, still causes frustration because the interface elements Blizzard provides as alternatives are sometimes significantly worse than their mod predecessors. But the long-term vision is good, because the developers then know exactly what tools players have available and can design boss fights accordingly. At least during my first dungeon runs, I immediately noticed that I was paying much more attention to what was actually happening in the game instead of just blindly listening to my add-on warnings. And then there's the long-awaited housing feature that has finally been introduced with Midnight and is meant to become a completely new pillar of the WoW experience. Here, Blizzard really exceeded all expectations, as you can see again in the preview video mentioned earlier. And in the end, that is probably what Holly Longdale means when she talks about making Warcraft accessible to a broader audience. Not that there will no longer be war in Warcraft, but that Warcraft today is or can be more than Horde versus Alliance or Void versus Light. In the past, the focus was always heavily on the endgame. Dungeons, raids, gear, squeezing the maximum performance out of your character. I love that part of the game, but WoW has always also been a game for story fans, treasure hunters, explorers, mount and pet collectors, and now also for hobby architects who want to unleash their creativity. I think it's good that Blizzard wants to give more love again to these aspects that had moved into the background. If someone can find fulfillment in collecting decorations for months and building a house, and it feels like a complete experience without dungeons, raids, or PvP battles, then that's first of all a gain for our favorite game that ensures much-needed new blood in the player base. And since housing is the big feature of Midnight, it's not surprising that so much promotional material, like the housing trailer, has such a different tone than we're used to. That doesn't necessarily mean Blizzard has forgotten the old Warcraft, but I still won't let you off the hook, Blizzard. Epic battles, big story moments, war, and honor belong to the absolute DNA of your game, and you owe it to your longtime players not to forget that. I hope Midnight will still truly blow us away, and I'm very excited for the raids. This time, Season 1 will include 3 of them right away. I hope you enjoyed this small first impression of the story.